Welcome to part two. Once again, thank you for volunteering in Shropshire. And as we go through the presentation, please can you make sure that you've got something to make notes on, whether that's electronic or a pen and paper, as once again, there are some reflective questions for you to answer as we go through. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jessica Whitfield, a Service Manager from the Children's Society. Karen Littleford has provided information for this training, and Karen is the Safeguarding Adults Lead for Shropshire Partners in Care. I will be co-delivering this training with Corinne Chidley, who is the Safeguarding Training for the Shropshire Safeguarding Partnership, and also Sarah Hollinshead Bland, who is the Statutory Safeguarding Business Partner for the Shropshire Safeguarding Community Partnership.
So now we're going to look at the trigger trio, which used to be referred to as the toxic trio. When a child tragically dies or has been significantly harmed, the circumstances are always investigated. And what we know is that in a family where there's domestic violence and abuse, drug or alcohol misuse, and parental mental ill health, there is a greater possibility that a child or young person may be abused and neglected, both physically and emotionally. The support in these families is often focused on the parents' needs. Just for a minute, put yourselves in the shoes of a child in a family. You choose your age, whether you're 6 or 8, whether you're 12 or 15, and imagine that one or more of the trigger trio is present. What do you think you'd have for breakfast? Who do you think would make it? How would you get clean clothes? Who's going to give you a cuddle? What about lunch? Who do you talk to? What do you think you'll have for dinner? Do you think that you'll have a bedtime routine, a bath, a toothbrush? If you're at the age where you need a bedtime story, where are your books kept? Who's going to read your story? Do you have clean bedding? Do you even have a mattress that's got sheets on it? Bearing all this in mind, how well do you think you'd sleep? Think about a parent who's either perpetrating domestic violence and abuse and the parent who's doing their best to survive every single day. Think about them self-medicating to help them get through the day with alcohol, prescription drugs, or illegal drugs even. And think about their mental health. All these things may be a constant issue, or sometimes, or an occasional issue. What damage do you think it does to not know what's going to happen? Imagine the confusion when you've just been born. Imagine your life chances if you're aged 2, 3 or 4 and this is all you've known. Remember that you are the eyes and ears, and if you're concerned about an adult or a child, then please say something.
We've just been considering family dynamics and how both risk and vulnerability can increase for adults and children. When we are looking at domestic abuse, there is often an over-reliance on one person to provide for the family. For example, it could be a mobility car that ends up being misused and not used in their best interests. Adults, older people, single people, or people with a disability could be isolated due to Shropshire's rural location. Being physically dependent on others can also increase the risk of abuse. Often, for adults that have suffered abuse growing up will have lower self-esteem and low self-confidence, thinking very little of themselves, and this also increases their risk of vulnerability as they feel like they deserve to be treated badly. It could be the adult may be targeted at certain times and not understand that they are experiencing abuse. For those children and adults who experience difficulties with communications, they may not be able to seek help or disclose that they are experiencing abuse, which again could lead them to be singled out by an abuser. Whole families, couples, single people and children can be the focus of antisocial behaviour, including verbal abuse, bullying, aggressive and threatening behaviour and damages to possessions or property. If you need to pass information on to ensure someone's safety, please ensure you do. Have a think about this question. What increases the child or adult's vulnerability to abuse? And jot down your answers.
Now we're going to talk about the adult safeguarding principles. Did you know that they were statutory? This means that you have to apply these principles I would suggest not only in relation to safeguarding, but in relation to your day-to-day work with people. There are 6 of them. Do you know any of them? Well, I'll soon help you remember. Before we talk about the principles in more detail, let's talk about making safeguarding personal. The best way to start discussing this subject is to think about ourselves. If you were in an abusive situation, would you want somebody stepping in and taking control of your life, or would you prefer somebody to talk to you about it and involve you in that process? When we put it like that, it's really easy, isn't it? But unfortunately, for many, many years, and unfortunately it does still happen, we tend to do safeguarding to people, and it's really important we change that. The Care Act is very clear that making safeguarding personal is absolutely key to safeguarding practice. So what does it mean? It means that we involve the person from the very beginning, throughout the whole process. It's really important that any action or interventions that we take are not disproportionate to the abuse that people are experiencing. And it's most definitely really important that our interventions are not worse for the person than the abuse that they're experiencing. We'll talk a little bit more about the order in which to do things, but it's very important that people are involved in all of the decision making about their lives. So here's question 2 for you. Making safeguarding personal is about A, telling how the adult they should keep themselves safe, B, putting the adult at the centre of safeguarding, or C, making sure safeguarding is done really quickly. I'm sure I don't need to give you very long to think about the answer, and of course the answer is B. Let's now have a look at the 6 safeguarding principles in a bit more detail. I've got a challenge for you. I'd like you to be able to quote these off the top of your head without even thinking about it. So really pay attention. Now, although we're going to go through these separately, it's important to remember that they do interlink, and they interlink in different ways. And I think as we're talking, that'll become obvious. So let's have a look at empowerment. It's probably a term that you're all familiar with. It's not something we do to people either. We don't empower them. We haven't got a magic wand to do that. But what we can do is provide people with the support and the skills to help them empower themselves. And involving them in the safeguarding process all the way through is an essential part of doing that. Let's move on to prevention. There are different types of prevention, but what I want to talk about is how we prevent abuse from happening in the first instance. It's why we have our message of if you see something, say something. Our emphasis very much is on if it's safe to do so, stop it from happening. But it's really important that people don't experience harm, if it's at all possible, that we can help them to stop it. You've already heard me mention the word disproportion, so we're going to talk about proportionality now. What does that mean? And it's a very difficult word to describe without actually saying proportionality all over again. But actually what it means is getting the balance right. It means making sure that we don't underreact to something that's very risky or overreact to something that's not as risky. Those are very difficult judgments to make, but our safeguarding partnership document on risk, working with risk, And the Safeguarding Adults in Shropshire process helps you work that out. Protection is the next one that we'll have a look at, and that probably does what it says on the tin, doesn't it? It's about making sure people are protected from the abuse of others, and in the case of self-neglect, sometimes protected from themselves. But what's really important, particularly if you link back to the empowerment principle, is making sure that people are part of their own protection plan. Make sure people understand what's happening and what they might need to do to keep themselves safe, so that it puts them back in control of the situation that they're in. Partnership again speaks for itself, and it's very, very rare that it's a single agency that can deal with an abusive situation with a person. Often it requires many, many different agencies providing support to the individual to help keep them safe. But don't forget that the person who's affected by abuse is also a partner in this. And again, you can start to see how that links to other principles like empowerment and protection. And the last one here is accountability. Be accountable for your thoughts and for your views about what is happening to a person. If you believe somebody's being abused, and it's not risky to do so, it's really important that you talk to them about it. We've said in previous sessions, safeguarding is everybody's business. And that doesn't mean just pick up the phone. It means try and do your best to stop it happening, linking back to prevention and responding quickly and supportively and empowering the person to help them deal with it themselves. Now, as if I haven't given you enough to remember, I've now got 5 more principles for you to really start thinking about and embedding into the way that you work with people. These principles come from the Mental Capacity Act, and this card was produced as a way of trying to help people understand what they're entitled to, but also to remind professionals in a simple way of what those principles are. And that first rule, that first principle, is that we should always assume that the person has capacity. So start by thinking, I can make my decision for myself. If in that process it becomes apparent that I might not understand what you're telling me, this is where the second principle is very important. Do all you can to help me make the decision for myself. That might mean communicating with me in a completely different way. I recently came across an excellent example of a worker who'd been trying to engage somebody in face-to-face visits and literally getting nothing more from a grunt out of them. Because of COVID-19, the visits were happening less, as you all are aware, and the worker ended up having a phone call with the individual. At first, the worker didn't even think it was the person. They thought they were speaking to their dad. But actually, the best form of communication for this person were on the phone. They were highly articulate, they were very intelligent, and she's now started a completely different relationship with that person. So do whatever you can to communicate in different ways with people so that they're empowered to make the decision themselves. Now, this third principle is about unwise decisions, and I'm sure that we've all made unwise decisions at different times of our lives. I'll put my hand up, I certainly have. But this is really important. Just because somebody is making a decision that we wouldn't make, or we'd rather they didn't make because they're putting themselves at risk, you mustn't say that I lack capacity just because you don't like my decision or it seems unwise. That's a really difficult one to stick to, but you must always keep yourself in check if you're making judgments about people's decision making. Now we're starting to move on to if somebody does end up lacking capacity, Decisions must be made in the best interests of the person, and there's a best interest checklist to support any of that decision making process. If the person can't make that decision for themselves, their previous views though should always be taken into account if they're known. If you do have to make decisions on behalf of people who lack capacity, then you must make it the least restrictive option for that individual. So putting it as it says on the card, check the decision made does not stop my freedom more than what is needed.
Whistleblowing applies whether you're a volunteer or not. It applies in your day-to-day job. Whistleblowing is about taking responsibility and taking action to protect people from experiencing neglect and abuse. Thinking about our principles, this is very much linked to accountability. If you see something, do something. If you can't do something, then it's really important that you say something about it. You might come across things that really concern you. You might think inadequate care is in place for adults and children with care and support needs. You might think you're coming across some dodgy or illegal acts or potential corruption. For example, health and safety violations, environmental damage cover-ups. It's very difficult to step out of your comfort zone and to do something about it, but it's your responsibility to help keep people safe.
Here's a third question for you to think about. When might you need to whistleblow about the behaviour or conduct of another volunteer or paid worker? In our previous slide, we talked about some examples. Have you ever come across a situation where you've had to do this? How did you feel about it?
There are lots of reasons why a child or adult might tell someone that they're being abused. The abuse could be getting worse. They might have realised the abuse is wrong. Someone may have asked them directly, or they feel that they can't cope anymore. It's really important that you actively listen with open body language without being judgmental. Let them know that they've done the right thing by telling you. Abuse can often stay secret for a long time, so sharing this with the right person that they trust and your reassurance can have a big impact. Don't ever promise to keep what they've told you a secret. It's important that you make a record of what you've been told and that you're really clear with them about who you're going to tell. That could be your line manager. Remember that you are the eyes and ears. If you've seen something that doesn't feel right, you're worried, you need advice, or you need to check something out, then say something.
Here's the fourth question for you. When should you share information? Only one option is right. Which one would you pick? Is it A, you should share information only with the person's consent? B, information should be shared without consent in circumstances where there are concerns for the safety of an individual. If you see something, say something. C, you should share information with other people when they ask for it. I'm sure you've got the right answer. Of course it's B. This slide is about when you think about raising an adult safeguarding concern. The first thing to consider is, does the person have care and support needs? Now, it doesn't matter whether the local authority are already supporting them. They could be just under the care of their GP. But if they need additional help and support to live safely and to maintain their well-being, then you probably will have met number one. The second thing to ask yourself is whether the person is experiencing or at risk of abuse and neglect. And moving on to the third question, as a result of their care and support needs, is that person unable to protect themselves from either the risk or the experience of abuse or neglect? If you've answered yes to all three of those questions, you need to think about raising a safeguarding adult concern. Now, on the previous slide, we looked at the first 3 questions. If you've answered yes to all of those, these are the next 3 questions you need to consider. Does the adult want the concern raised? Can they do it themselves? Because that would be the preference, wouldn't it? That would fit with our empowerment principle. It might be that they don't want to raise the concern themselves for all kinds of different reasons. So the next question you need to work through with them is, do they need support to do it? If they don't, and they can raise it themselves, then that's even better. But they might not feel able to do it even with your support. Your next discussion with them should be, do they want it raised on their behalf? It might be they want you to raise it. It might be they prefer somebody else to do it. It might be they say no, they don't want anybody to do anything about it at all. And this is where you have a very, very difficult decision now. Because you have to make a decision about whether there is a public or vital interest that means the concern needs to be raised anyway. So let's just have a little look at these words, public interest and vital interest. What do we mean by that? What do you think I mean? Well, public interest is not just because the public wants to know. It's because the public may very well be affected. So we're talking about things like a criminal offence may have been committed. Now, when we're talking about vital interest, we're talking about the needs of the person. Is it vital that this safeguarding concern is raised? Because is their safety at such risk? Is their health and well-being at such risk of deterioration that whether they consent or not, that safeguarding concern needs to be raised? So just to reiterate what we've said in previous slides, your starting point needs to be a discussion with the person about your concerns, unless there's a real risk that it could increase the risk to them or others. Now, I'm not giving you that as an out, that's not something to hide behind, but you have to have a real reason why you wouldn't be talking to the person in the first instance themselves. And then if you take them through all of those questions and give them all of those opportunities, you may very well find that they are more able and you've supported and empowered them to make the concern themselves. Here's some information about our websites where you can get much more detailed information. Please take time to have a look at the websites, and the following slides contain lots of links for you to get even more information and access to resources. Thank you very much for attending this training session.